Hi everyone, welcome to my today's video. When it comes to Eelam War IV, the Tamils have a big trauma, especially the last phase of this war that ended with a genocidal massacre on the Tamil people, and also that the LTT was wiped out as a fighting force. But still, we Tamils haven't looked at the Eelam War IV through an analytical lens to truly understand how the LTT was defeated. And for that, I'm going to look at the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war and take examples of it so we can compare it with the Eelam War IV, that we have an understanding how Sri Lanka was able to pull it off.
You forgot one very important thing, mate.
But before some of you say, you forgot this or you forgot that, this is just a partial view on the Eelam War IV and not the full perspective on it. As Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and the fighting broke out in Donbass, Ukraine already started to build a defensive network in the Donbass, and it was a three-line defense centered across major urban centers in the Donbass, expecting an upcoming Russian invasion. And they were right. In 2022, Russia invaded, and the main part of the fighting is going on in the Donbass, especially after the Russian offensive on the capital Kyiv failed. And the Russians have built a similar defensive line in Zaporizhia, a southern province in Ukraine. And this defensive line was a five-line defense network. And the importance of such defense networks was visible, especially during the Ukrainian summer offensive for 2023, as they were only able to reach the first line of defense. And also the Russians are still fighting in the Donbass after 3 years of intense combat. And in Eelam War IV, there was a similar defensive networks by the Tamils. It was the Nagarkoil-Muhammale forward defensive line. Already in the end of the Eelam War III, major fightings took place in this place. As an example, the Tigris offensive, Unceasing Waves 4, where they tried to capture Jaffna, or the Agnikila offensive by Sri Lanka, where they tried to recapture the Elephant Pass, took place in this region. And even in Eelam War IV, this line was unpenetratable. Sri Lanka tried several times to capture it, just to fail miserably and lose several hundreds of soldiers and tanks. But how did Sri Lanka capture the Muhammale and Nagarkoil FDL? It was very simple. They conquered the whole west coast till Punagari, and from Punagari they moved eastwards till Barandan, where they drove a wedge between Kilinochi and the Muhammale Nagarkoil FDL. After that, the LTT was forced to pull back from this region. But how was Sri Lanka able to pull this off? And to understand this, we have to look at one of the most important battles during the Russia-Ukrainian war, and this was the Battle of Bakhmut. The Battle of Bakhmut is considered as one of the bloodiest battles in Europe since the end of the Second World War. This city had a symbolical value, and for that, both sides put in many resources. And in May 2023, Russia came out as a victor from this battle. And what's very interesting about this battle is that it weren't the Russian armed forces who captured the city, but it was a Russian mercenary company named Wagner. And Wagner was able to pull this off because they used a tactic where they used small infantry units. And with these units, they were able to overwhelm Ukrainian positions. And soon afterwards, the Russian armed forces took over the strategy and created the storm set units. And the Ukraine did the same. Sri Lanka used a similar tactic during Eelam War IV, and it was called the SIOT. To understand this, we have to look at Eelam War III. During Eelam War III, after Sri Lanka captured Jaffna, they tried to open up a land route to Jaffna. And for that, they needed to capture the A9 highway that was dissecting Vanni, the LTT's stronghold. And for this battle, they moved their army in huge formations, where they were stopped at LTT defensive lines. And even before they were able to reach the LTT's defensive line, they were caught up by LTT's IEDs and other obstacles, while being fired at by the LTT's mortars and artilleries. But besides that, the LTT outflanked them and also struck in the rear, where Sri Lanka's major logistical hubs were located. But during these battles, Sri Lanka realized something. During these intense battles, some smaller units got lost in the chaos, and walked through LTT's areas for several days undetected before finding a way back to their own territory. During the ceasefire agreement between 2002 and 2006, Sri Lanka used this knowledge to restructure its infantry units. They trained their soldiers in these SIOT methods and integrated them in their infantry battalions. There, these soldiers acted as instructors and upgraded the quality of these formations. And some units only consisted of these SIOT trained soldiers. And with these capabilities, the Sri Lankan commanders had new tools in their arsenal. Firstly, these SIOT trained soldiers patrolled aggressively on the contact lines. And through that, Sri Lanka didn't have a static defensive line, and it was more fluid. And through that, the LTT wasn't able to penetrate these lines. And also, with these capabilities, Sri Lanka didn't attack in the depth, but on a broader front. And these 4 to 8 to 12 men strong units were able to penetrate the LTT's lines undetected and were able to flank the static defense of the LTT and calling in accurate air or artillery strikes. And combined with LTT's lack of manpower that was resulting from Karuna's defection, the war weariness of the Tamil population in the LTT's controlled area that just got stronger during the ceasefire agreement, and that the Tamils being a numerical minority was deadly. And Sri Lanka was able to slowly grind down the LTT. Napoleon believed that God fights on the side with the best artillery. And he was right, because in a conventional war, the artillery conquers. That became evident during the Russo-Ukrainian war. Especially during the Battle of Bakhmut, the artillery usage on both sides was on an all-time high. It was estimated that Russia fired 20,000 to 50,000 artillery shells on a daily basis, while Ukraine fired up to 7,000 artillery shells a day. And combined with the drones, this artillery became very accurate and very deadly. Nowadays, the usage of artillery has decreased because both sides are using FPV drones, but artillery is still relevant today. Artillery played always a huge role during the Eelam Wars on both sides. The LTT started to act as a conventional army during the Second Eelam War. During LTT's first conventional offensive, named Ahaya Kadalvalichamar, they tried to capture the Elephant Pass, which is the only land route to Jaffna. And in this failed offensive, the LTT realized that they needed artillery capabilities to fight a conventional war. Besides having mortar capabilities, the LTT realized they needed more firepower. And they were able to capture their first artillery piece in 1996, where they attacked the Mullaitivu camp. And soon after, additional artillery pieces were captured. And through that, Sri Lanka felt the devastating effect of artillery fire. And to counter the LTT's artillery, Sri Lanka used during Eelam War IV these SIOT trained units, because smaller units are more difficult to hit with artillery, and also if they are being hit, it wasn't as devastating as a huge formation was hit by the LTT's artillery. And Sri Lanka also increased its own artillery capabilities. As an example, they received the RM-70 from Czechoslovakia during the ceasefire agreement. And many of Sri Lanka's allies gave a huge amount of artillery shells to Sri Lanka. As an example, after Sri Lanka captured the East completely from the LTT in 2007, and their stock of artillery shells was depleted, Pakistan donated them several 100,000 of artillery shells, so Sri Lanka was able to continue the offensive towards the north. And to understand the importance of Sri Lanka's artillery capabilities during the Eelam War IV, we have to look at the one number. In March 2009, as the battle for Pudukkottai was raging, Sri Lanka fired up to 1,000 artillery shells a day. Compared with the Russian usage during the Battle of Bakhmut, it's nothing. But Russia's front line is more than 1,000 kilometers long. And as LTT's territory was shrinking, this artillery usage became deadly, not only for its own fighters, but also for the civilians. Especially in the last phase of Eelam War IV, Tamil civilians were lured into so-called no-fire zones, where they were trapped and bombed by artillery. Besides having UAVs, like in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, where Sri Lanka used them to locate the LTT, to accurately bomb them, they still weren't able to see the civilians caught up in the no-fire zones. And they argued that the LTT used them as human shields, which resulted in the mass casualties of Tamil civilians.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard.
One of the main reasons why the LTT wasn't able to counter, as an example, these SIOT trained troops or these massive artillery barrages was one technology that was introduced during Eelam War IV. And that was real-time intelligence gathered by satellites that was given by the US to Sri Lanka. Like in the Russia-Ukraine war, where the US shared real-time intelligence with Ukraine, and through that Ukraine was able to accurately hit high-value Russian targets with the HIMARS, or were even able to sink the Russian flagship of their Black Sea fleet. And through this intelligence, Sri Lanka was able to sink the LTT's container ships in international waters. And these ships played a crucial role in the supply of the LTT. It is estimated that at least 8 of these ships were destroyed during the Eelam War IV. And the first ships were already destroyed during 2003, when peace talks were going on. And this was very crucial because in the period from 2002 till 2009, only one ship was able to reach the shores of Tamil Eelam. While during Eelam War III, especially during the Operation Jesikuru, LTT ships landed on a weekly basis on the shores and bringing in supplies. And this was felt by Sri Lanka during Operation Jesikuru. As an example, during the Battle of Manangulam, where a Sri Lankan Special Force unit was wiped out as the LTT fired up to 800 mortar shells. And such high barrage wasn't possible during Eelam War IV because no supplies were coming in. I think these examples give you a very good insight what kind of problems the LTT faced in Eelam War IV that resulted in their destruction. But many of you may ask, why are we looking at this? Because the armed struggle is over. There is important that we look on a quote by Mao. Mao said, "Politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed." And for that, it's evident that we learn the lessons from Eelam War IV for the actual phase of the Tamil struggle. As a historian, it's very easy to learn from the past, but it's very difficult to implement it in the present. The LTT wasn't able to win this war, but they could have stopped this offensive. But what could have happened afterwards?
I guess we'll never know.
And an additional reason why the LTT wasn't able to stop the offensive was because some of its leading members were in these positions based on seniority and their loyalty towards the organization. Besides that, they weren't able to adapt to the new realities of Eelam War IV. And I've witnessed a similar tendency when I was active in a specific Tamil group. As I addressed this issue, the organization replied the following.
Try to relax your anus.
Thank you very much for your attention. Please leave a like or a comment in the comment section, and I wish you a nice day.